In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Department of Defense Adaptive Readiness for Culture model, and more importantly, what that model suggests for what objectives we should have in education, what in the educational establishment can we do to prepare students to operate in an intercultural environment. So this is the title of the piece by Rasmussen, Seek, and Durham. They did this in 2016 under contract for the Defense Department, and they developed a model of culture, general competence for education and training. And what they did is they looked at just a whole bunch of people in the Defense Department who are acknowledged as being good at this, right? And they were people who were good at operating in cross-cultural environments. And they surveyed them and they did research and they were trying to discover, empirically what it was about these people, what commonalities they had. And they identified 4 general categories, right? That they said, look, these folks have these characteristics, right? They have a diplomatic mindset. They engage in cultural learning. They're capable of cultural reasoning. And they act in very productive ways that will be discussed in intercultural interaction, right? And so this is not just a theoretical construct here, right? This is research into people who have been there and done that. And it's trying to say, okay, what are the trends? What are the commonalities here? So while this is not the be-all and end-all, I think this is a good place to start at saying, hey, what should we be trying to do in courses about intercultural relations and cultural competency to develop students as part of this? And a key thing here is there's education and training. And so I think we need to make a distinction between these two things before we look at each of these 4 aspects of the model. So training versus education. And I think this is very important for us to consider. And in the military or in anything, right, training can be seen as teaching a particular skill or type of behavior, right? And so in the military, there's often, or at least in the Army that I was part of, you had task, condition, standard. People had to accomplish a task under certain circumstances and do it in a particular way to standard. And so you taught that, and you taught a skill to a person. And so it's a very particular type of behavior or skill. Education, well, by the way, the definition of education here, when I looked up these things to try to say, okay, what's the common thing? Education, the definitions of education were all over the place. Training, everyone pretty much had the same thing. But I kind of boiled it down. And first of all, education is a purposeful activity. Of course, training is too. But it has 3 aims I want to look at here. The first one is transmitting knowledge, right? And I couldn't help but go with Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones. I drink wine and I know things. And there's a certain amount of knowledge, right? You just learn stuff and it may come in handy later, right? But, you don't know the circumstance in which learning something will be applied, right? You have knowledge, you don't know exactly how it will be applied or, what you're supposed to do with it. So we can't have a task, condition, standard, right? But generally, there's this knowledge component. That's interesting. Then there's a lot of discussion of fostering skills and character traits, right? And this is something a little bit meta in a way, that the process of education is thought to foster some skills in people, like training, but also character traits, right? And so I look at this and I go, well, what might these be? And I think we'll look at that, the desirable traits in each category of this model later. But, one is learning to learn, right? That's a big thing you learn in education. You learn how to learn, and educators will frequently talk about that. There's also this cosmopolitanism, right? Being exposed to different people, different circumstances. That's very much, especially in university education, we think that's a very big factor, right, in developing people. And what else? Well, we can look at those. Now, there is a certain paternalism here, right? And so a lot of folks who are in education might be like, well, I don't really try to foster a character trait. Other people, will say, no, we're trying to create integrity in individuals, blah, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, I think, maybe a part of education, but not necessarily something I'm going to try to do with my courses. Finally, there's developing understanding, and this is a big part of this, I think, that developing understanding is about learning how the world works. Why do things happen? What are the underlying cause and effect relationships in the world? We want to understand. And frequently, like a colleague of mine, Dr. Rich Leday, he will talk about the difference between training and education as being, hey, we can train a soldier how to use a weapon, but education is necessary for the soldier to understand how using the weapon wins a battle or wins the war and what it does, right, and how it works together. And so education is aimed at developing understanding. And along with that, we could talk about character traits, rational, critical thinking skills. I mean, those are perhaps some skills we could add in above, but these are the things. And so I look at this and say, this is what we're looking at. Where are we talking about for education? I really want to focus in on knowledge and understanding. Now, to get back to these four things, these four components of a effective cross-cultural person, the diplomatic mindset, right? And so Rasmussen, Seek, and Dern break it out into four areas. And they say that for each of these, like diplomatic mindset, is characterized by certain abilities, right? And so the first one for diplomatic mindset is the ability to be aware of one's own worldview and mission in a cultural context, right? So this, by the way, there's very much the assumption that somebody is out to do something, right? This is about people working in this area, which for educational purposes, if I'm teaching someone in school, well, they might, we like to think they'll eventually go do a mission, but, we kind of are like, well, we just want you to be aware on, that's just good enough for itself. But let's keep this mission focus going on, with this caveat that it's not the be all and end all. So being aware of one's own worldview and mission, what you're trying to achieve in a cultural context. Recognizing that the purpose of building intercultural relations is to achieve mission objectives and to manage one's own attitudes towards the culture to accomplish mission relevant tasks, right? And this is very, very much mission oriented, practical, pragmatic concerns here, that you need to, keep your eye on the ball. You're here to do a mission, right? And also don't go native, right? There's that old thing that there's that concern that as people learn about other cultures, they will then start to adapt to them and side with them and lose their perspective and lose the reason they came here. And pretty much the whole movie Lawrence of Arabia is about that, right? But this is, as we'll see, this is maybe just more pragmatic advice. Then there's understand how your own self and the U.S. in general are viewed by members of other cultures. So that here we're back to understanding. So if we look at these things here, then we have that question of what is education? Where is understanding and knowledge relevant, right? And I think being aware of one's own worldview, that's very much an understanding. Understanding one's own self and the U.S. in general, how they're viewed by other people, very much something we can look at. The middle one, though, I'm going to say that's less of something we want to focus on. So the two big educational objectives here are these two. For cultural learning, right, the first thing is learn cultural concepts and knowledge to prepare for cultural interactions. You can tell I'm going to keep that one, right? Deliberately seek out experiences and relationships to advance cultural understanding while deployed. And again, they were going through and they said, look, this is what these people do, right? The people who are successful, this is what they do. But this kind of looks more like a character trait, but let's keep moving here. Develop reliable sources of cultural information, right? And just to foreshadow, I think that's kind of a learning how to learn situation. But, say, hey, I'm going to need information. Where can I go? What's reliable on this? Critical thinking skill. And finally, continue to reflect on and learn from cultural interactions and experiences. And so if we look at these things, first, I think we can drop out the seek out experiences. Presumably, anyone who's taking my class in intercultural relations is doing that already. So that's it's not irrelevant. It's just not within the scope of the course. And in fact, it's almost a precondition of the course. Continue to reflect on and learn from intercultural experiences. I think that's much more of a character trait. I don't know that we're going to do that through education. Like I say, in any class I teach, I'm really I don't know. I'm not paternalistic enough to say that I'm going to develop character traits. But these two things, I think, are very much something that education can do. Okay, for cultural reasoning, the first thing is the ability to make sense of situations or environments and manage unexpected cultural behavior. Right? This seems to me to be very much a skill, right? But we'll talk about that more in a sec. Then use one's existing cultural knowledge to develop nuanced explanations of events. This is more about understanding, right? Explaining events. And this seems, again, perhaps this is a skill, right? You're supposed to develop a nuanced explanation, but it looks like the kind of thing we do in education. And explanations, whenever I hear the word explain, I think it's about identifying underlying cause and effect relationships. Why is something happening? What's causing this, right? Nuanced means bringing in other factors, right? Non-obvious, complicated factors. Well, in fact, we can talk about nuance, but this seems to be in our wheelhouse. Then there's this sentence. Understand and apply perspective-taking skills to detect, analyze, and consider the point of view of people who are raised in a different culture, as well as demonstrate an understanding of others' needs and expectations. Whoa! What is that about? So I think we're going to have to rewrite that one, right, and simplify that a bit. But let's look at, okay, what do we want to keep from this? Well, like I said, the first one I think is very much about, skills and in the field doing things. And I think we're going to prepare people, we're going to support that, but that is not necessarily what we're going to be able to teach in a course. I think, as I said, the second one, absolutely in our wheelhouse. And this last one, let's wipe the board here and rewrite this in more, direct language. If we look at what the key phrases were in that sentence, I would rewrite it. Detect, analyze, and consider the point of view and, as well as the needs and expectations of people who are raised in a different culture. I think that says what the other ones had, I think that has everything that we needed in it. Change my mind. But we're going with it. Okay. And on to the last category. Okay, the last category talks about how people act in intercultural interactions. And just to let you know ahead of time, I think all of these are going to be outside of, I think this category by and large is outside the scope of what we're going to teach in a classroom course. But let's look at what they're talking about here. So engage with others when own cultural knowledge is rudimentary and cultural appropriate actions are uncertain, right? You have this ability to do that, right? Again, that sounds like a skill, right? And that is something that would be difficult to do in a class. Consider desired effects to achieve communication in advance. Now, there's an understanding component to this where, hey, how does communication work? What are the effects of communication? How do you achieve them? I think that's very much part, but that goes back to some of the understandings we talked about earlier, developing nuanced explanations of events. If the event is communication, explanation is its effectiveness. So, and considering desired effects, that's a good thing to do in the moment, but again, kind of a skill. Use alternative strategies for achieving communication objectives. And finally, present oneself in a way to achieve intended effects. So these, to my mind, are all skills or behaviors. These are things that I think you build on someone's education and you train them to do, or experience. You give them experience doing. So again, you might disagree, but I'm going to say that these things are not part of the objectives that courses like the ones I teach should be focused on. So let's go consider the full list. Okay, so here we are at the end with the educational objectives, right? Being aware of one's own worldview in a cultural context. Understand how own self in the U.S. in general are viewed by members of culture. So this is know yourself and have an understanding of how other people view you, right? How might they be different? That's one thing right there. Learn cultural concepts and knowledge to prepare for cultural interaction. So we need to, get some book learning in us to understand. And I think a huge part of that is learning the known unknowns, right? If you're not preparing to interact in one particular culture, there's that thing of, hey, what are the things I'm going to have to know, and what are how do people, what are common things, right? What are different types of societies? Do we have categorizations? Are there similarities? And these are things, the concepts I think are very important to have, so that you go in and say, okay, here's what I need to learn in this situation. And then if you're going to have to learn it, develop reliable sources of cultural information. And I think this is generally part of our research agenda and components in courses, where we say to people, all right, here's where you go. And hopefully we're providing reliable sources of cultural information through education, but also learning how to learn, giving people, okay, here's where you can go to find this stuff out. Finally, the ability to develop nuanced explanations. I think that, that is a good student outcome, right? Can you explain an event in a nuanced way that takes into account cultural effects? I think that's going to be a very important one. And finally, we have this, it is very clear: detect, analyze, and consider the point of view, needs, and expectations of people who are raised in a different culture. That is being able to analyze other actors to understand where they're coming from, just a huge part of political science. So these are, I think, some culture-specific objectives, and these are definitely the kinds of things I'm going to try to do in my course. Here is the reference to Rasmussen, Sick, and Duren's original work.